few years ago, a young founder launched an innovative product design to shake up the home fitness industry. As his company grew rapidly, advice started pouring in from investors, mentors, and even friends. Some pushed him to expand quickly and focus on sales volume. Others advised him to pivot to a subscription model, saying it was the future of a tech-driven business. The advice was conflicting, leaving the founder uncertain with which direction to take. The entrepreneur was John Foley of Peloton. While many around him were suggesting a pivot to quick growth strategies, Foley stayed focused on what made Peloton unique, combining hardware, content, community. By staying true to his vision and filtering through advice, Foley avoided short-term pivots and instead built Peloton into a billion-dollar brand. The ability to discern which advice aligns with his long-term goals is a critical factor for Peloton's success. Today, we'll be discussing advice discernment with mentors and experts. How do you figure out which advice to follow when so many opinions come your way? And how do you prioritize guidance that aligns with your unique vision? How do you decide whether you're going to listen to Anthony or me?
Or current.
Or current, pretty much. All that and more in today's How to Founder. Hello, my name is Chris Franks.
And I'm Anthony Franco. Welcome to How to Founder, where you, the founder, learn tips, tricks, and details that MBA professors and college professors like evil Chris refuse to teach you. Today we have Current, a friend of mine, a friend of ours.
I'm going to say, like, well, yeah, it's ours because...
A friend of ours. What's that from Johnny Brasco? A friend of mine?
Yes, friend of mine. He's a friend of mine. Friend of ours. Yeah.
He's a friend of ours. So Current is he's a certified discernment expert.
100%.
How did you get certified in such a topic?
I got a degree in Anthony.
Oh, there you go. God, that's a worthless fucking yeah. Hope you're not in debt from that one.
He came with the zingers this morning. Current actually runs. He's the president of a company called Renegade Plastics. They make. Well, Current, why don't you tell us what Renegade Plastics does really quick?
Well, the ultimate mission of Renegade Plastics is to build a circular economy for industrial textiles.
I understood like two of those words.
Exactly.
Circular and economy.
Yeah, exactly.
So industrial textiles.
But those two don't make sense together.
Yeah.
You know, just individually.
It sounds good, right?
It sounds good.
So you're going to invest, right?
They make really PVC, PFAS-free, phthalate-free
textiles that are used in everything from like billboards to bus seats to airplane seats to composites.
It's really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So, and just where are we, Anthony? What is this week? What are we doing here this week? Why do I look like
you're in a really awkward spot on the camera. You're like photobombing the podcast, which is not.
How about we just do this?
There you go. So we're part of Denver Startup Week this week. We're coming to you live from the CU Denver campus, the business campus.
CU Business School.
Tomorrow, so tonight we have the happy hour.
Yeah.
So join us for the Denver Founders Happy Hour. Tomorrow we've got another How to Founder podcast. Hopefully the basics of accounting will actually happen tomorrow.
We'll see.
And then visit us live at Startup Garage in the Commons in Champa. That's going to be a blast. And then we're back here at the campus at noon to make fun of how people pitch, basically.
Good point.
All right. So Chris.
I was going to say, I'm just thinking about all the shitty advice people have been giving out this week at Startup Week. I'm going to guess that there's been a fair amount of shitty advice. Well, it's all about SaaS these days. And so it really is pretty funny because there are people like me that believe that I have the answer to every question for every startup, right? And there's people that Anthony might have the exact opposite advice,
which is likely,
which is kind of one of the reasons why we like doing this, is because we oftentimes have the exact opposite advice. So just dive right into how do I figure out who to listen to, who to ignore, what to do, And like, who to just kind of go, let's see.
There's a recursive loop in this podcast, I just realized, because
What's that?
we're giving advice on what advice to give. How do you know if we need to take the advice that we're giving? Like, there's this like weird
It's
thing.
very meta, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very.
Right.
So maybe we should just.
Focus on the advice not to take.
Yes. Let's start there.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So Chris, there's got to be a question here.
Yeah, no, just how do I start to filter? Like if I'm going out and starting to think, so we all know as founders, the most important thing we can do is to actually get feedback and accept that feedback and really take it to heart. But again, you're gonna get those moments where they just don't make sense. And so what is your approach to start to filter those concepts?
So I like to break advice into a couple different categories. And if I had more time on a whiteboard, this would probably be like a 4x4.
We have whiteboard right here.
But I mean, I really look at it as, there's paid advice and free advice, right? And I definitely bucket the this advisor gets a little bit of equity into that paid advice category.
Because there's some financial transaction.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then investor advice is somewhere in the gray zone, right? They do have a financial incentive, but they gave you money. So
But it is funny, because the conventional wisdom is smart money.
Right.
Like smart money is like, oh, I want to bring you in because you're going to give me great advice.
Yeah.
And the reality is investors have a vested interest by definition.
Right. Exactly.
But can give really crappy advice.
You give terrible.
Yeah, but I mean, there's times when they're like, hey, look, my daughter's getting married in 3 years. I'm going to push you to move faster to liquidity.
Yeah.
Because I want my money back. It has nothing to do with you and the company.
Yes. So those are kind of the two buckets. And then I'd say the other one is there's kind of like the broader strategy advice. You've got your unpaid advisors, your paid advisors, or mentors, or what have you. And then they can either provide broad, general strategy advice, right? Or what do I do in this situation? Or how do I think about this situation? Or there's the technical advice, right? And the technical advice is, I'm starting a startup. How do I incorporate?
Right.
Right. Which I have seen, and it happened to us, where we used the wrong lawyer and we got the wrong advice and we had to pay for it later on.
Right.
And we were, we thought we were being careful, and because it was a business lawyer who founds companies, but he founds companies in Wisconsin. He didn't know how to do.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it turns out that not every lawyer knows what the fuck they're talking about.
Right. And of course, every VC wants a Delaware incorporated startup.
Right.
And he was like, I'll do that for you. And so we did a Delaware incorporated startup, but he made mistakes, and we had to pay a couple grand, 2 years later to fix those mistakes. So if you think about it, there's the paid advisors, the unpaid advisors, and then in terms of the advice, there's the technical advice, tactical, I'm building my business model, how do I do X? And then there's the broad spectrum, general advice, strategic advice, how do I think about this problem?
Got it. So I really want to riff off the idea of the paid advisors for a second, because I think it's a really critical point that we miss off, which is, hey, Anthony, you're the only other entrepreneur I know. I need some help. Who should I go talk to? Oh, go talk to Bob. He's the guy down the street from me. He's a lawyer. Well, it turns out he's a healthcare lawyer or something like that.
Well, yesterday we found out somebody, great example of the wrong lawyer, right? So they had their M&A, they were selling their company and hired the founder's divorce lawyer to manage the M&A transaction,
right.
Which is such a bad idea. Not only because she didn't have the expertise, but also she was like, this is a zero-sum game.
Yeah, we're fighting.
Right?
Everything is a fight.
Yeah.
It's funny because I feel like, particularly early stage founders, they don't know how to vet attorneys, accountants, the paid advisors. Yeah. And so I think probably the summation of this advice is hey, let's make sure that you find the right person.
So how?
Early. Yes, but I think that's the question. So how do you go about doing that? How do you, as an early stage founder, start to ask the question of who is the right person to hire for this job?
Yeah. So I would say the best sources of good technical expertise that I've gotten are through either my own formed groups of other startup founders who I've met through accelerators, whatever, and we've stayed in touch. I have WhatsApp groups, I have email groups, text chains of guys I went through boot camp with at X Accelerator, and we're all still, 3 years later, we all still have startups, amazing. But, we can all rely on each other for good recommendations. The other one is there are those like startup founder or startup operator focused groups out there that are focused either like for CFOs or COOs and they have message boards, and those also have really good sources of advice. There are a lot of people like filtering in there who are like, oh, I'm the COO of X company, and that X company is a financial consultancy for, and so they're going to push like, oh, hey, I'm looking for somebody to help me build my financial model. And they're going to push their own services, but you are going to have other founders come out and say like, I used these guys 3 weeks ago. They're amazing.
Right. So if I just tactically, in your experience, what questions do you ask when you're sitting across from, and we'll use an attorney and maybe do the same thing for an accountant. And I don't know if there's any other really technical people that you need that early on, but how would you do vetting? So even if somebody, because you're interviewing them, it doesn't feel that way as a founder. You're just like, oh, please help me. Oh, you'll say you have this stuff. That's great.
Yeah.
And
that's actually right.
Right. And but the attorney's going to
you're grateful for the service that you're paying them to provide you.
But the attorney's going to be like, oh, I'm definitely giving you a great deal, right? I'm going to discount my service, whether they are or not.
Right.
Probably not. But you still need to vet them. You still need to ask those questions. You still need to make sure they're the right fit for you. So what are some of those questions you would ask to make sure they are the right fit?
So I really approach hiring paid advice as if I'm hiring somebody into my company. Because in reality, as a startup, these are your employees. If you think about a big work company, they have internal lawyers. They have internal financial people, right? They do the work for you. At a startup, you can't afford that. You're hiring people on a per hour, whatever basis. Right. And so I view these people as if I am hiring them onto my team as I would any other employee.
I think it's a phenomenal way to approach it. And I didn't early on. I was like, use a lawyer down the street. I used the accountant who, like, my buddy's buddy, neither of which were good fit. And I did do zero interviewing. I didn't ask any tough questions. But if you're like, hey, look, you were particularly an attorney, like accountants trying to come and go a little bit. Your attorney typically is going to be with you for the life of the company if you do it right.
Yep. And so, for example, our attorney, who's been amazing, I made him give me a list of 6 startups that he has advised that were at the similar stage. I didn't want the Series C ones that he was able to sell off for $1 billion.
Yeah.
I wanted the ones that he took from 0 to 20. And I talked to all of them. And all of them are like, these guys will respond to your emails. They will respond at 10 p.m. They will meet you where you're at. They will prevent you from doing this. And I was like, okay, like that's the attorney you're going to. And we talked to like the coolies, and we talked to the other guys, and they're like, oh, well, we're coolies, so we're the best. We have all the resources in the world. And I'm like, I know you are. You guys, everybody knows you. But like, I'm talking to the other advisors, and they're like, well, yeah, of course they've got, we work, so we get ignored sometimes.
Yeah.
So
right. I mean, I think it's a phenomenal thing, because the second point is like ask the right questions, but then actually ask for references.
Yeah.
And call them.
A lot of advisors, like attorneys and accountants, will not give references.
Really?
Yeah. Because you don't want your customers to suffer from reference fatigue as well. So you're giving out Bob Smith all the time, and Bob Smith's getting a call every week for references. So I
think that speaks to the relationship that the lawyer or the accountant has with their customers, and also their ability to discern. We're talking about advice to discern which startups to. Hey, I asked this guy last month to be a reference. I'm not going to ask him this month, so I'm going to go to someone else.
Also, that would kind of be a red flag for me. I think
I'm not saying it's a green flag. It's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, I think, but the notion there is, if part of what you're going to rely on these early paid advisors for is the ability for them to introduce you to people that are your peers, investors, advisors, people that can help potential customers. That's really genuinely.
And for your financial person and your lawyer, they should have a network that will.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for those two, for sure.
And so the notion is that it is partly a technical skills there.
Yeah.
But particularly early stage, they need to have good technical skills, but be willing to invest in you by making an introduction.
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's sometimes it's harder than charging you $3,000, right? It's hard to be like, hey, as a lawyer, I believe in you enough to introduce you to my investor friends.
Right.
And you're burning social capital at that point as a lawyer. So they better believe in you, and you better ask me, the lawyer, to be like, hey, are you willing to do this? Because if the answer is no, you need to find that lawyer.
Well, and those early stage advisors are also the ones where, like, I mean, we had an issue where an investor dropped out at the last minute. We had another investor coming in, but we were planning on paying our lawyer and our accountant with that money that was coming in. And we had built up that trust and the relationship with them that we were able to say, hey, you were working on this deal with us. It didn't happen, but this other one is happening. Can you wait 2 months for us to pay?
Yeah.
Right. And if you were working with a big firm where you were just another client, the answer you would get was like, yeah, at X% interest.
Yeah.
And these guys were like, no interest. We got you. We know that, like, what's going on. We're invested in you, right? Like, they're taking stock of, they're looking for the long run. They're there to support you.
I've heard this question, but while we're still on the paid advisory category, would you ever give a lawyer a half point of early equity or any sort of taste of equity?
No, not a lawyer. Definitely not a lawyer.
Even if they are helping you and punting your bills and things like that?
No, because they're also the one that is making sure our cap table is correct.
Yeah.
I
agree with that.
There's a conflict.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. But I've seen people that are like, I'm just gonna give him a point or something because he's such a great guy.
Yeah.
I think if once they are your corporate attorney, first of all, the lawyer should say no. But second of all, that is a paid relationship.
And there might be even like an SEC violation with that.
It could be.
Probably. Yeah. Yeah. I'd be worried about that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the accountant, similarly, I mean, I think, if it's somebody who's your accountant, they're doing your books for you, they're looking at the cap table as well, I would be wary of giving them a point or something like that.
But I think it's one of the things that you hear constantly from founders is like, oh, I don't have any cash to pay an attorney, so I'm just going to try to do equity everywhere I can to pay for stuff. And I get it. Like, I've been that broke where paying a lawyer was really fucking hard. But at the same time, you got to figure out a way to go hire a good attorney and pay him the right amount, because if you don't, the ways that you can fuck it up just compound down the road.
Yeah. Well, and there's, and cost is definitely a concern. And I think there's two things that our team has done in order to control those legal costs. One is, don't go with one of the big boy startup firms that charge $1,700 an hour. There are dozens of startup focused firms. They all came from the big boys.
Yeah, that's like I said. They're all ex-Cooley.
They're all
ex-Cooley, ex-Holland,
exactly.
which are great firms. But
right.
Yeah.
If you're Series B.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of those alumni from those firms who have started up boutique shops with 10 partners, and they do amazing work, and you're getting the same quality, and they charge a third of the price.
Right.
And they also can give you really good recommendations on how to cut costs. And we literally had a lawyer who was like, look, seriesc.org has all the documents that you need for a lot of these things. So go there, find the documents that you need, get them to 90%, and then send them to me to review. And to be honest, like, all the AI tools that are out there are really good at that too.
I was going to ask about that. Like, how much can you rely on ChatGPT to be an advisor?
So, not as an advisor.
I was gonna say, every lawyer, like, if lawyers listen to this, they're just cringing.
But
never rely on you.
Our lawyer did tell it. He's like, look, if I'm going to do this, this is where I'm going to get all the documents. So you go there, you get the templates. I mean, Cooley has templates on their website.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Right. So
it's my big sister just went to work for a startup. She's an attorney, and they're like a company that is specifically doing like your company's AI toolkit for legal. It's like, oh fuck, that's gonna take over.
Yeah.
Like, a couple of years, like, that's gonna be how every company uses legal services. It's like, oh, you have a lawyer to go in to look at stuff, but just like 85% of the contracts are the same thing. It's like templates, but using AI. It's pretty cool.
exactly. So
All right, so we've got paid advice, good shit. make sure you pay, make sure you hire, make sure that you ask the right questions, make sure you really truly vet people. Pretend you're hiring a long-term employee because you are in a lot of cases. What about the other advice? What about when you show up at Denver Startup Week and you run into people wearing Hunger Founder t-shirts? And we love giving advice, right?
Yeah.
Advice is like assholes. We all have them, they all stink, right? So I mean, the notion is, how do you start to filter the signal to the noise of the other startup community?
Right. Well, I think as you transition from kind of these paid technical people, right, and we can include like your website designer, right? You're like, hey, I need CAD drawings of this, right? Like professional engineering services. That's all in that paid category. It's like they give really solid technical advice.
Yeah. Maybe not. You don't want to ask them like strategy stuff, but hey, this is a really important way for you to think about your website.
Exactly. And so as you transition to that kind of the unpaid advice, I feel like there's this group in the middle who are the people that are the broad category startup mentors who you meet at Denver Startup Week.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I was part of a startup XYZ, or oh, I did the internal innovation at X large corporation.
Fucking wrong.
Right. And or I was on Wall Street for 20 years, and now
I'm going to tell you about business.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those guys who, men and women, but they're typically guys, and who mansplain. And they're this huge category that want to charge you for the general advice.
Right.
They're not giving you the technical, like, okay, give me a week and I'm going to beef up your financial model, right? They're going to be like, well, have you thought about this? Oh, that's $1,000.
Right.
Right.
I would love to be that person. I'm just not douchey enough to do it.
I'm just going to sit there.
I'm just going to sit there and be like,
everybody wants to do strategy.
Everybody wants to do strategy.
Yeah.
And
everybody.
I did corporate strategy for 10 years. It is not that same strategy. It is not what people say they are doing.
Right. I'm teaching corporate strategy probably in a room very similar to this next semester. I'm reading corporate strategy like, wow, this is not. So you got, what are the red flags? Because it is a really critical point. Because there's people that come up, typically they look very polished and professional, and they will tell you a great story. And there is a moment like where now I'm like, even talking about it, I'm like, get the fuck out of there.
Yeah.
Turn and run. Don't walk. Just get the fuck out of there.
There's a problem, right? So as founders, we're internal optimists that believe that we can accomplish our goal, and we're also paranoid that we don't know what the hell we're doing.
Right.
And we want, I find myself doing this all the time in an area that I have no understanding on. I want to believe this person's a select that can dig me out of a hole or put me into an opportunity that I couldn't do on my own. So I want to believe.
And yet
somebody giving me advice.
Absolutely. And you want to believe that this person across the table from you has the secret metaphorical Rolodex where it's like, oh dude, I can get you investment. I just need to work.
Or I can get you into. I fucking salespeople do this all the time. It's like they're coming with the Rolodex. The Rolodex is worth shit.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you want to believe it. You want to believe there's an easy button to the thing that you're worried about, and there's just not.
But it's like, this is one of those things where we're all old and grumpy. We've gone through it 150 times. The early stage founder that comes across this by accident, sorry. But if you come across this, what are those things? Like, what are those triggers where people are starting, where you're going, like,
they're full of shit.
Yeah. What is it? I'm not sure that I know, but what do you guys think?
So I would say, well, I break them into two categories. The people who do genuinely have startup experience, right? Okay, I'm listening, right? And the people who are like, well, I worked for Lehman Brothers, and I looked at investments in early stage companies. And now I've retired from Wall Street, and now I advise startups. That's the person I run away from.
Right, and when they say early stage companies, they're talking about post-IPO companies. When we talk about early stage companies, it's two dudes hacking on something.
Yeah, they're not even in a garage, they're in a coffee shop.
Right.
They can't afford
a garage.
Right.
Exactly.
They're on a side hustle.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a really good point.
So I think there are those, and then there's also the ones where, I mean, the number of digital marketing firms, like advisors that like come to me, they're like, I'm gonna growth hack you, and you're like, no, I'm not gonna lie. because you don't know my industry, right?
Well, and Chris has a saying, growth hacks work exactly one time.
Right.
Every growth hack works
Exactly one time.
Yeah.
And then it's not a growth hack anymore.
Right.
Now it's a system that doesn't work.
No, it's a strategy.
Yeah. That's a strategy.
I did a 90-minute talk yesterday, and it was all like, hey guys, this is fucking hard. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I know you're coming in here for the secrets. Like, oh, this is a secret sauce. Like, no, you gotta you actually have to go talk to people.
So how do you take advice from founders that have been there? Like that kind of, how do you discern what to listen to, what not to?
So the advisors are really hard so those are the ones that I feel like that's where mistakes get made, because they're like, oh, I did a startup, I was part of the founding team, right? Or I was early on and I have all this advice that I can help you out about. And I think the challenge there is if they are not in the exact specific industry that you are in, they should never be providing the general advice. They should be providing advice about very, very specific targeted things. And we went through this, right? We brought on one of our angel investors, was part of an exit, he had a bunch of cash, he invested in us, it was awesome. And then he came back and he's like, hey, look, do you guys want help fundraising? Right? As from an advisor standpoint, right? I'm not gonna go introduce you, but I'll coach you, I'll help you manage your list, everything like that. Well, a couple of weeks into it, we realized that he only started managing his startups portfolio of investment strategy after they were a Series A.
Mm.
And if you're a pre-seed,
it's a whole different,
it's a completely different game. And so we realized pretty early on that he wasn't really giving the best advice. And also, and this was when we were really early, right? We didn't know what we were doing, or we thought we didn't know what we were doing. But the other thing was that he had exited 6 months prior, so he was actually more focused on renovating his house. And so we were so we actually cut the cord. We said, look, we promised you 2 points. We're going to give you 1 point, and we're terminating this agreement.
How was that even? Because he's an angel investor, right? He owns equity. He's on the cap table, so theoretically that could be an awkward metaphorical Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, I let my CEO handle that one.
That's pretty good. All right.
Yeah.
You could do it.
So I would say the previous startup founder one is, I think that's the trap that a lot of founders fall into, because that startup could have been 5 years ago. Well, the fundraising environment 5 years ago was completely different than it is today. Right. People move on, right? VCs move on. They move on to different organizations like that. So they don't have a magical Rolodex. And, I think, people would be like, oh, well, I did a crypto company 7 years ago. Run away, right? Because it's just the fundraising market is completely different. SaaS is different than CPG, right? And or textiles, right? And so unless somebody specifically did an exact startup in your field, and they know oh, you got to be really careful about this safety certification that you need in order to deploy in this industry, they're going to just be giving you general advice.
Right. That
is not really helpful.
Also, just to put a fine point on this conversation, I do not believe, and I have not heard one example of somebody being able to outsource any fundraising activity.
No.
It is your fucking job as a founder to raise money.
It's like outsourcing attracting customers.
Right. You can't
outsource that.
It is your job. And it's like this thing, because I, as a founder, want to believe that I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, but clearly all I have to do is pay you $1,000 plus a percentage of the money you bring in, and it's you go raise money for me. You can't do it. I mean, it feels attractive to do that, but it just doesn't fucking work.
Yeah. Well, that you definitely are violating SEC regulations if you do that.
Right.
Right.
I mean, there was a guy that I worked on a project years and years ago, and really smart guy who made a bunch of money in a company that went up. And he was self-funding this company, and he just wouldn't fucking fundraise because he was rich. And he didn't want to go kick down doors and be like, dude, invest. Do all the really hard work. And he tried to outsource it. It didn't work. I kept on being, this fucking terrible idea. You got to go raise money, man. He's like, you go do it. I was like, I'm not the fucking founder.
Be really cautious of any paid advisor that requires you retain, a a fundraise, somebody that's going to help you fundraise, that requires a retainer, somebody that's going to help you, buy Google ads, and they require a $10,000 a month retainer.
I feel like we need to have.
Like hell.
I feel like we need to have, the Goodwill Hunting retainer. That should be one of our go-to videos. Like, how much taught you listen to retainer? Okay, so let's just reset halfway through. Advice discernment. How do you figure out what advice to listen to, what advice to ignore, where we've gotten to this point? The technical advisors treat like employees, make sure that they know what they're doing, but really interview and check references, things like that. For people around Startup Week, the other groups that just kind of want to give you advice, be very, very careful and try to find domain matching, right?
And volume. Like the more people you hear from, you can start to develop an intuition around it.
Right. I think it's good.
Yeah.
There is, and just be aware because there are fuck tons of people that are dumb because they're trying to make money off of startup people and we don't have a lot of money.
Right.
But that really desperately want to do that thing of like, I used to work at Lehman Brothers. Now I want to advise you how to raise a pre-seed round, which is nonsensical.
Right.
But
then you have investor advice. And I have a story on the investor advice. So going through an accelerator, one of the founders was trying to make a decision on how to navigate his company. I don't get into the details. And he asked his lead investor, and his lead investor gave him some advice. And he followed that advice to the letter. And it was terrible advice. And when somebody asked him, I asked him, why did you do this thing? Like this was obviously, he says, well, my investor told me to do it. Right. And so fine, if your investor is also operational in the business, and they tell you have to do it, you kind of have to do it. If your investor is not operational in business and you do it, and it was the wrong decision, whose fault is it? Right. Your investors or yours?
Yep. And it's such an interesting point, Anthony.
Yes.
And it's like it also goes to a very like geeky but awesome piece of like why corporate governance is the way it is.
Yeah.
Which is there are people that are typically investors that sit on your board of directors. Their job is to hire and fire the managers of the company. You, as the founder, are the manager of the company. You manage the fucking company. The board can give you advice, right? And they'd be like, hey, we think about this. At the end of the day, they have one job. It's to hire and fire the management team. And so if you're managing the company as a founder, it is your job. You can seek advice, you can look for advice, you can get it. But at the end of the day, it is up to you to make those decisions.
Side note on that, if you're talking to a founder and they tell you have to check with the board, they're full of shit. They're telling you they're delaying. They're delaying, right? They don't have to check with the board. They're like, I don't know how to give you this answer, so I'm going to give you the answer later.
Unless it's granting equity.
Yes, unless it's granting equity. Yeah.
That is always the one that we're like, we have to check with the board because also like, dude, are we going to get this guy equity? No, we're not going to give this guy equity. What are you talking about?
But it's also really funny. Sometimes you hear that. It's like, oh, well, I've got to sit down with the board, decide whether we're going to sign a contract. Like, you either have
pre-seed board meetings or via text message.
Yeah. And you take
screenshots of it and you upload it to your data room.
Right. Or you go get a beer. Like that's what most of my I know a couple people that are like, hey,
sorry, I didn't mean to divert it, but
yeah.
So talk about taking advice from investors.
Okay.
Looking to investors for advice. Because there's a danger in that too, right?
Yeah. And actually I will say one of our investors, or angel investors, is actually probably like some of the best advice we go. But I had a quick segue analogy.
Yeah.
Do you guys remember like asking for directions before there were smartphones?
Yes.
Like, on the street?
Yes, I know. Somebody just asked me for directions and I was getting coffee.
Yeah, and you're like, hey, how do I get to like X, right? And if you follow that person's advice to a T, you're probably gonna get lost. And you would always ask like 2 or 3 people.
Yeah.
Right? You would go like to the end of the block, and then you would ask somebody else, like the guy with the hot dogs.
Along your way. That's a great analogy.
Along your way. And
That's
you're like, hey, I just wanted to double check, is XYZ is down there, right? And they're like, dude, no, it's that way. And you're like, okay, right? I mean, nowadays we just follow Google Maps, right? Or whatever. But back then, you would ask a couple people along your way. And you might change directions at the last minute because somebody would be like, no, that road's closed. Go 1 more block and then take a left, right? And I think startup founders are used to, this is how you get to your destination. You follow this path and you don't deviate from it because it's already updated with all the road closures and everything like that, even though it's not. And I think what you actually need to do is you need to ask directions along the way. And it is your decision if you want to follow those directions or not. When if you ask somebody for advice and they tell you to take a shortcut down a dark alley, you say, that's not a great idea.
That doesn't feel great.
That doesn't feel great,
Yeah.
right? And I think getting advice as a startup founder is really similar. You want to ask people along your way at different steps of the journey, right? And it is fully your discretion if you want to follow.
To take your analogy further, people that are close to the area you're at.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So you move down. The person that gave you advice when you're here is not. They're living in a different neighborhood than where you are now.
I'm not going to ask people in Nebraska for advice in Colorado or for directions in Colorado. Right. Like they know how to get out of Nebraska. Once you get to Colorado, you might ask separate directions. Also, startup.
They both have cows.
Our new startup idea is Google Maps for founders.
Google Maps for
Yeah,
founders.
that's it. It's like we're gonna say.
There you go.
I thought we were going to be
here.
doing anything to help founders because there's no money in it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very bad one.
We keep
So
navigating.
is that where like founders can drop pins for like where there's like an SEC percent?
Yes, exactly.
Tax
really good.
audit or
Yeah, God dang it. That's really
okay,
good.
going back to Anthony's actual question of investor advice. All right. Again, break two camps. They're the ones who are invested in you because they have a bunch of money, and then they're the ones that are investing in you because they believe in what you're doing and they know at least reasonably well like what you're doing and want to be able to help you. I would say one of our better advisors, he was previously the CFO of a Series C company that's valued at billions of dollars, right? And he moved out of there, and the reason why he gives such great advice is he limits advice. He doesn't give advice about sales strategy, he doesn't give advice about this. He only gives it on financial stuff, right? And tactical financial stuff, right? Because he ran he was at, tech, like real tech. We are a materials company. And he will say, like, look, you guys have to, like, there are parts of your financial model that are beyond me because you guys carry physical inventory and stuff like that. But he has given us amazing advice. And I would say the best advice that he's given is, right, like we had to overhaul our financial model. And I texted him and I said, we need to overhaul our financial model. I need a consultant to come in and rebuild it for us. And I don't want somebody who's only worked on SaaS companies. And he found a guy who was previously a founder who had managed a CPG company. So he understood vast amounts of fast-moving physical products and the amount of inventory you have to carry and how you have to model that so that when we presented this model to investors, we could easily say, like, yeah, we can actually get debt to finance the growth at a certain point, which is really hard to do with a software company, but is more straightforward with
You factor the inventory.
factor the inventory. So he's been an amazing advisor. I would say the other absolutely best advisor that we have is actually not an investor. She does have a couple points of equity. She was actually part of a fund, an investor fund, that looked at us. We went all the way through diligence, and at the 72 hours before signing, they backed out due to internal politics reasons. I have nothing against that fund. I love them. And but she was so committed. She believed so dearly in like what we were doing that she has effectively, she has joined as an advisor, got permission from her fund to avoid conflicts of interest and things like that. And she gives great strategic advice about raising. And it's amazing because she's on the other side, right? She looks at deals all the time. She works for a VC fund. Right. So those are the two best of types of, I would put her kind of in our investor advice. A lot of the other investors are people who just have money. And they really don't know your business.
I was about to say, just because you have money does not make you smart. I just want to throw it out there. We tend to think early stage founders are like, oh, you're rich.
If the corollary is true, we're brilliant.
Yeah. That's right, exactly. It's, oh, you're rich, so clearly you know what the fuck you're doing.
Right.
Like, no, dude, you inherit from your dad. Like, you're smart. You know what the fuck you're doing.
And I see this all the time with angels, especially very active angels. We got some feedback from an angel group, and they were all pushing to your point, like, oh, my daughter's wedding is in 3 years, so I want to get, a return. Right. Like angels want money back in under 5 years.
Yeah,
right.
Angels do?
Yeah, they do. I mean, it's never happens.
It never happens. But in their minds,
in their minds,
it's going to be a $3 billion exit.
Right. And And so the advice they get is much more short term than, I mean, it's kind of what you said with Peloton, like short term pivots.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, we know our industry pretty well. We know if we want to exit, we need to have manufacturing assets. Right. We don't want to be a distributor of materials. We want to be a manufacturer of materials. Just distribution companies are valued very low. Right. Manufacturing companies in our industry are very multiples higher than a distribution company. And we got, you know, advice from an angel group saying like, well, why would you want to build a factory? Like, you should just exit in 3 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like, like, if you look at all the multiples in this industry, the distributors are exiting at, you know, 0.8% of revenue. I mean, like 0.8 of revenue, 0.8x of revenue. The manufacturers are exiting at 1.5 to 2. Why are you giving us the advice to like go to?
Why would you want to reduce the value of your investment?
And it's because they're looking at like CPG companies where there's a very robust system of tool manufacturers and groups like that, where you can go to a tool manufacturer who has built a reputation on not screwing over startups, right? And you can build a company around that, and you can exit to a big CPG company. Now, this being said, now we're transitioning from like advice into like, but I'll bring it back to advice. So I did corporate strategy for 10 years with a couple of big CPG companies.
So you're the person that we should be running from.
Yeah. No, because I do not tell startups like, oh, I know what to do. I very quickly realized I didn't want to be an advisor to a startup. I should just start a company. But I did M&A, right? Yeah. I did M&A of startups. I looked at companies. I decided whether we should buy them or not. And I built the evaluation frameworks of, are you going to get past that first discernment of acquisition? Yeah. Right. And so it's interesting because like I know that my co-founder worked on M&A when he worked at Bain, right? We understand how M&A works, and we know what companies are looking for. And it's pretty amazing when these, you know, advisors, angels come in and they're like, you should do X, Y, Z. And we're like, and that's going to remove you from candidacy of acquisition by about 60% of the time. So no, we're not going to do that. And then they get flustered and angry, and they're like, "Well, how do you know that?" And you're like,
"Because I fucking did it." Exactly.
I think you bring up something really important, Karen. That I think is important when you're talking to, especially with investors, about the advice they're giving you. And that is, a lot of founders I've seen nod their head and then don't follow the advice. Yeah. And so the investor thinks, okay, they're going to do this in the next board meeting, the next conversation. How's this thing going? I haven't made it. Like they don't have that candid conversation up front. Like, here's why I'm not going to follow your advice, and have the intellectual argument about why. I think it's incredibly important to do that. Not just take the advice, but also how to tell the person, I'm not going to follow that and why. Is really important when you're looking at advice.
It's a great point. So let's wrap this up. Yeah. So I think that from the second half of the conversation, I think there's two really big takeaways for me personally. The first one is, if you're a person that's actually giving startup advice, be fucking humble and know what you're giving advice, which is literally the opposite of what we're doing. We're just giving people broad advice about everything because we think we're smart. But give people very specific advice based on your area of expertise. This job is very, very specific, and the advice that you want to seek out and truly go seek it out, don't just kind of wander around bumping into people, is very specific on a problem that you're trying to solve, which I think is really critical. At the end of this, really it comes down to be very, very cautious about the advice that you accept, because it's got to be you. And a lot of that comes down to your fear as a founder of not knowing the answer. But also, at the end of the day, you have to make those decisions. No advisor, no investor, no board member, no customer, nobody can make those decisions. It has to be for you. Okay, really amazing conversation. It's so interesting because I was like, oh, we're going to talk about whiplash, like advice whiplash that you get at Techstars. And I think you brought like this, no, it's like investors and, the paid advisor. That's really, truly kind of the universe that you live in. Also, just make sure that it's got to be you that makes the decision at the end of the day. Whew, big ones. All right. I think that'll do it for today. Appreciate our huge studio audience. Thank you. We didn't ask for questions because we just kept blabbering. today. So we appreciate that. And we've got one more live tomorrow. What are we talking-
Fingers crossed. Tomorrow we're talking about accounting basics for founders. So what is retained earnings? Like really exciting topics, like what is retained earnings and how to read a P&L. I actually am looking forward to it. Also, follow us on linkedin.com/companies/howtofounder, or on YouTube. Our channel is just at How to Founder. Karen, where can we find out more about you?
Renegadeplastics.com, and you can buy one of our tarps on Amazon. They're pretty cool.
They're pretty cool.
Renegade tarp.
Renegade tarp. Leave a great review.
Renegade. It's just not just a normal tarp. It's a renegade tarp.
And then next week, are you in town?
For the Tuesday, not the Thursday.
So we're going to have one episode next week. Anyway, thank you very much, guys. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow. I'll help us out.
Oh, yeah. It's your professionalism that I respect.